April 1946. Stuttgart, Germany. The American occupation zone. 24-year-old Sergeant Thomas Mitchell stood in front of the ruins of St. Martin's School, his hands shaking as he held a photograph he'd carried across the Atlantic Ocean twice, once as a liberator, once as something he couldn't quite name yet. In the photograph, a young German woman in a threadbare coat stood among the rubble, with 12 children huddled around her like chicks around a hen. Her name was Anneliese Hoffmann. She was 26 years old. And 6 months ago, when Thomas's unit had rolled through Stuttgart in the final push toward Berlin, she'd done something that had shattered everything he thought he knew about the enemy. She'd hidden 3 American soldiers in that school's basement when SS units were executing prisoners in the street above. Thomas had been one of those soldiers. Now he was back. Not with a rifle, not with orders, but with $2,000 he'd saved from his combat pay, a duffel bag full of construction tools, and a promise he'd made to a woman who'd risked everything to show mercy to men she'd been taught to hate. "I will help you rebuild," he'd told her in broken German on the day his unit moved out. "When this is over, I will come back." She'd looked at him like he was speaking a language that didn't exist. "Americans don't come back to help," she'd whispered. "They come back to punish." But here he was, standing in the ruins, proving her wrong, or trying to. If this story shakes everything you thought you knew about what happened after the war ended, hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. These are the stories that didn't make it into the history books, the moments when former enemies chose to build instead of destroy, and I want to know how far these forgotten truths can reach. 6 months earlier. October 1945. Thomas Mitchell had been in combat for 11 months when his squad got pinned down in Stuttgart. The city was already falling, everyone knew it, but some SS units were still fighting street to street, executing deserters, stringing up civilians who'd shown white flags from their windows. Thomas and 2 other soldiers, Bobby Kowalski from Chicago and Jim Chen from San Francisco, had gotten separated from their unit during a firefight near the old cathedral, pinned in an alley. SS troops hunting them building by building. That's when they saw the basement window, St. Martin's School, half collapsed from Allied bombing runs, the sign above the door hanging at an angle. But the basement looked intact, and they were out of options. Thomas kicked in the window and dropped inside, his rifle ready, expecting abandoned classrooms or maybe German soldiers waiting to shoot. Instead, he found 13 people huddled in the darkness. 12 children, ranging from maybe 5 years old to 14, and one woman, rail-thin, her blonde hair tied back with a strip of cloth, her dress patched and repatched until it was more patches than dress. She stood in front of the children like a shield, her arms spread wide, and spoke in rapid German that Thomas's limited language skills couldn't follow. "English?" he said, lowering his rifle slightly. "Do you speak English?" She switched languages mid-sentence, her accent thick but understandable. "Please don't hurt the children. They are orphans. Their parents are dead from the bombings. I am their teacher. We have nothing. No weapons. No soldiers. Please." Bobby and Jim tumbled through the window behind Thomas. The sound of German voices on the street above grew louder. Boots on cobblestones. Orders being shouted. "We're not here to hurt anyone," Thomas said quickly. "We're hiding. SS units are hunting for Allied soldiers. If they find us, they'll execute us in the street." The woman, Anneliese, though he didn't know her name yet, stared at him, really looked at him for the first time, saw the exhaustion in his face, the fear poorly hidden behind training, the blood on his uniform that might have been his or might have been someone else's. Then she did something that would change Thomas's life forever. She turned to the children and spoke in German, soft, calm, authoritative. The children immediately moved to a corner of the basement, sitting in absolute silence, their eyes wide but trusting. Then Anneliese pointed to a small storage room at the back of the basement. "In there. Quickly. If the SS come, I will tell them we are alone. But you must be absolutely silent. The children, they are good at being quiet. They have learned. You must learn too." Thomas hesitated. "If they find us here, They'll kill you, all of you." "Yes," Annalise said simply. "So don't let them find you." They hid in that storage room for 14 hours, through the sound of boots overhead, through German voices shouting questions, through the terrible, brief sounds of gunfire in the street that meant someone else hadn't been lucky enough to find a hiding place. Annalise brought them water once, bread that was more sawdust than grain, told them in whispered English that the SS had searched the school twice but hadn't found the basement entrance yet, wouldn't find it if the children kept quiet. "Why are you helping us?" Thomas asked in the darkness, his voice barely audible. Annalise was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow with exhaustion and something deeper. "Because I am tired of death, tired of cruelty, tired of being told that mercy is weakness and hatred is strength." She paused. "My brother was a soldier, Wehrmacht, not SS. He was 17 when he died on the Eastern Front. Before he left, he told me, 'Don't let the war make you forget how to be human.' So I haven't. I won't." When Thomas's unit finally retook that sector the next morning, and it was safe to emerge, he stood in the basement and looked at this German woman who'd risked everything, her life, the children's lives, everything to save 3 enemy soldiers. "Thank you," he said, the words completely inadequate. "Don't thank me," Annalise said. "Just remember that we are not all monsters, that some of us tried to stay human." "I'll remember," Thomas promised. Then, impulsively, desperately wanting to give her something in return, "When this is over, I'll come back. I'll help you rebuild this place, this school. I promise." She'd looked at him with eyes that had seen too much to believe in promises anymore. Americans don't come back to help, they come back to punish. But Thomas had meant it. Every word. Returning to Germany as a civilian in April 1946 was harder than Thomas had expected. The army didn't understand why anyone would want to go back. His family in Iowa thought he'd lost his mind. "You fought against them," his father had said on the phone, his voice tight with confusion and anger. "Now you want to help them rebuild? What about the Americans who died over there? What about your buddies who didn't come home?" Thomas didn't have a good answer. How could he explain that every night since leaving Stuttgart he'd dreamed about those 12 children sitting silently in the basement corner? About Annalise standing between them and danger, with nothing but her own body as a shield? How could he explain that being saved by someone you'd been taught to hate changes something fundamental in your soul? So he'd stopped trying to explain. He'd saved his money, $2,000 from combat pay and hazard bonuses. He'd bought tools. He'd gotten civilian papers. And he'd gotten on a ship back to Europe despite every reasonable person in his life telling him he was making a mistake. Now, he stood in the ruins of Stuttgart, surrounded by destruction that made his stomach turn. The city had been beautiful once. You could see it in the bones of the buildings still standing, in the grand architecture now reduced to hollow shells. But the Allied bombing campaign had been brutal. Block after block of rubble, entire neighborhoods erased. And the people, God, the people. They moved through the ruins like ghosts. Thin, pale, exhausted. Women in threadbare coats, old men with hollow eyes, children with faces too serious for their age. The ones Thomas passed on the street looked at him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope, trying to assess if this American was one of the kind ones or one of the cruel ones. The school was worse than he remembered. Half the roof had collapsed since he'd last seen it. Someone had spray-painted Nazi school across the remaining wall in angry English letters, which made Thomas's jaw clench because these had been children, orphaned children. Whatever sins their parents had committed, whatever horrors the regime had perpetrated, these kids had just been trying to survive. He found Annalise in what used to be the school's courtyard, teaching alphabet letters to 8 children using charcoal on broken pieces of concrete. She looked thinner than he remembered, more worn, gray threaded through her blonde hair despite her young age. She didn't recognize him at first, just saw an American soldier. He was still wearing parts of his uniform because civilian clothes were hard to find, and her body went tense, protective, ready. Then their eyes met. Her expression shifted from wariness to shock to disbelief. "You came back," she whispered in German. "I promised," Thomas said. She stood slowly, setting down the piece of charcoal, her hands shaking. "I thought you were dead, or that you had forgotten, or that it was just words soldiers say when they think they're going to die." It wasn't just words. Thomas set down his duffel bag, the tools inside clanking together. "I brought money, tools. I can work construction, my father's a carpenter, I thought. I thought maybe we could rebuild the roof, make it safe for the children, make it a real school." Again. Annalise stared at him like he was speaking a language she didn't understand. "Why would you do this? We lost the war. We are the enemy. Your country is supposed to punish us, not help us." Thomas thought about that question for a long moment, about how to put into words something that felt bigger than language. "Because you saved my life," he finally said. "Because you risked everything to show mercy when you didn't have to. Because if you can do that, if a German woman can hide American soldiers from the SS at the risk of her own life, then maybe the whole story we've been told about good guys and bad guys is more complicated than we thought." He paused, looking at the children watching from behind her with wide, curious eyes. "And because those kids deserve a school, they deserve a chance. Whatever their parents did, whatever happened in this war, they deserve a chance to grow up in a building with a roof and walls and heat in the winter." Annalise's eyes filled with tears. She didn't let them fall. Thomas suspected she'd trained herself long ago not to cry, but they shimmered there, caught between disbelief and desperate hope. "The occupation authorities will never approve this," she said quietly. "An American helping rebuild a German school? They will think you are a traitor or a fool." "Probably both," Thomas agreed, "but I'm here anyway. And I'm not leaving until this place has a roof." For the first time since the war ended, Annalise Hoffman smiled. Getting permission to rebuild the school took 3 weeks of bureaucratic nightmares. The American occupation authorities were suspicious. Why would a former combat soldier want to help the enemy? Was he being bribed? Blackmailed? Had he fallen in love with a German woman and lost his objectivity? Thomas told them the truth, that she'd saved his life, that he'd made a promise, that these were orphaned children who needed shelter and education. The officials looked at him like he was naive at best, treasonous at worst. It was a Red Cross worker named Margaret Patterson who finally helped push the paperwork through. She'd been in Stuttgart for 6 months, trying to coordinate aid distribution, and she'd met Annalise multiple times. "That woman is doing more good with nothing than most people do with everything," Margaret told Thomas over watery coffee in the occupation headquarters. "If you actually want to help, instead of just punish, I'll make sure the authorities don't stop you." God knows we need more people who remember that Germans are human beings too. The children helped. Thomas had forgotten how much children could accomplish when they were motivated. The oldest ones, 14, 15 years old, could hammer nails, carry boards, mix mortar. The younger ones could fetch tools, hold flashlights, clear rubble, and Annalise organized them like a small army, keeping everyone safe and productive and focused. Thomas taught them English words as they worked. Hammer, nail, roof, wall. The children repeated the words carefully, their accents thick, but their enthusiasm genuine. It was easier to teach them construction vocabulary than to explain why an American was helping them, so he stuck to simple words and let his actions speak louder. The other Germans in the neighborhood watched with a mixture of hope and suspicion. Some brought what they could spare, a few boards salvaged from other ruins, nails scavenged from collapsed buildings, cups of ersatz coffee made from roasted grain. Others kept their distance, afraid that American kindness was a trap, that there would be a price demanded later. An old man named Herr Weber, who'd lost both sons on the Eastern Front, came by on the 3rd day. He stood at the edge of the courtyard for an hour, just watching Thomas work on the roof beams. Finally he approached. "You are American," he said in heavily accented English. "Yes, sir." "You fought in the war." "Yes, sir." "And now you build us a school." Thomas wiped sweat from his forehead. squinting down from the roof. "Yes, sir." Herr Weber was quiet for a long moment. "My sons killed Americans on the Eastern Front, but still, they killed your countrymen." Thomas didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. "I hated your country," Herr Weber continued, his voice breaking. "Hated what you did to our cities. Hated that you won, and we lost. But I was wrong to hate. My sons were wrong to fight. And you are right to build." He paused, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small cloth bag. "I have nails. Not many, but enough to help. May I?" Thomas climbed down the ladder and took the bag. The nails were old, rusty, salvaged from God knows where, worth more than gold in post-war Germany. "Thank you," he said quietly. Herr Weber nodded once, turned, and walked away without another word. That night, Anneliese and Thomas sat in the partially rebuilt schoolroom, eating thin soup and hard bread that one of the neighborhood women had brought. "You are changing things here," Anneliese said softly. "The way people think, the way they see Americans." Thomas shook his head. "I'm just building a roof." "No, you are showing them that mercy is possible. That former enemies can become." She hesitated, searching for the word. "Not friends, maybe, but something. Something better than enemies." "Is that what we are?" Thomas asked. "Something better than enemies?" Anneliese met his eyes across the makeshift table. "I risked my life for you because I believed we were all human underneath the uniforms. You came back because you believed the same thing. So yes, I think we are something better than enemies." Outside, the spring rain started to fall. But for the first time in months, it wasn't falling through the roof of St. Martin's School. They were making progress, one beam at a time, one nail at a time, one small act of mercy building on another, until something new emerged from the ruins. By May, word had spread. The Red Cross contacted Thomas about other schools that needed help. Margaret Patterson wrote articles for American newspapers about the soldier who came back to rebuild. The stories got picked up, circulated, reprinted. Thomas started receiving letters. Dozens at first, then hundreds. Some were angry. Veterans who'd lost buddies in the war, who couldn't understand why Thomas would help the enemy. Mothers who'd lost sons, who thought every German should suffer for what the Nazis had done. Thomas read those letters carefully, understood their pain, but didn't change his mind. Other letters were different. "I was a prisoner of war in a German camp," wrote a veteran from Texas. "A German doctor there treated my infected wound when he could have let me die, saved my life. I've been wanting to find a way to repay that kindness. Can I send money for your school? My son was killed near Stuttgart," wrote a mother from Pennsylvania. "Before he died, he wrote me about a German family who shared their last loaf of bread with his unit. He said it made him remember that not everyone over there was evil. If rebuilding a school honors his memory, here's $50, build something good." The money started arriving. $5, $10, $20. Some letters included just $1 and an apology that it wasn't more. Thomas put every cent into the school. Better roofing materials, windows with actual glass, desks salvaged and repaired, books donated by American libraries, actual paint to cover the Nazi school graffiti with something gentler. And something else started happening. Other American soldiers stationed in Germany started showing up. Some were ordered by sympathetic officers who'd read about Thomas's project. Others came on their own time, on leave, with tools and skills, and a desire to do something that felt like building instead of occupying. A corporal from Brooklyn who'd been a plumber helped install working bathrooms. A sergeant from Tennessee who'd worked construction rebuilt the school's front steps. A lieutenant from California organized a donation drive among occupation troops that brought in enough supplies to repair the entire East Wing. "Why are you doing this?" Anneliese asked one evening, watching a dozen American soldiers work alongside German civilians, the two groups communicating through broken language and hand gestures and shared purpose. Thomas looked at the scene, former enemies working side by side, children playing in the courtyard, that was slowly transforming from rubble to schoolyard. "Because maybe this is how we actually win," he said quietly. "Not by crushing them completely, but by showing them there's another way. By proving that mercy is stronger than vengeance. That people can change. That we can build something better together than we ever could apart." Annalise stood beside him in silence, watching the sun set over the slowly healing city. "Do you think it will last?" she asked. "This goodwill? Or will it fade when the novelty wears off and everyone remembers that we were enemies just a year ago?" Thomas didn't have a good answer. He wanted to believe in the permanence of what they were building, but he was also a realist. He knew how quickly public opinion could shift, how easily generosity could curdle into resentment. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I know this. Right now, in this moment, we're choosing to build instead of destroy. And maybe if enough people make that choice, enough times, in enough places, it becomes something that lasts." The next day, a package arrived from America. A letter from a group of churches in Iowa, Thomas's home state, that had taken up a collection after reading about his work. Inside was a check for $500 and a note. "For the children, for the future, for showing us that the war doesn't have to end with hatred." Thomas showed the letter to Annalise, watched tears finally fall freely down her face as she read it. "They care. They care. They care," she whispered. "Americans who have never met us, who have no reason to help, who lost sons and brothers and husbands to German bullets, they care about our children." "Yes," Thomas said simply, "they do. That money bought real textbooks, heating for the winter, a small library, musical instruments salvaged and repaired so the children could learn to make music instead of just surviving in silence." September 1946. 5 months after Thomas had first returned to Stuttgart, St. Martin's School reopened its doors with a ceremony attended by over 200 people. German families from the neighborhood, American occupation officials, Red Cross workers, journalists from 3 countries, veterans who'd sent money, and the 12 children, now 16, as 4 more orphans had been taken in who'd survived in that basement 18 months ago. Annalise gave a speech in German that Margaret Patterson translated into English for the Americans present. "This building was destroyed by war," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly visible in her face. "Like so many buildings, like so many lives, like so much hope. We thought it was gone forever, just more rubble in a city of rubble. Just another casualty of choices we didn't make but suffered for anyway." She paused, looking at Thomas standing near the back of the crowd. But one American soldier remembered a promise, remembered that beneath the uniforms and the flags and the propaganda, we are all human. He came back not with weapons but with tools, not to punish but to build. And he showed all of us, that mercy is not weakness, that forgiveness is not forgetting, that we can acknowledge the terrible things that happened while still choosing to create something better moving forward. Thomas felt dozens of eyes turn toward him. He wanted to shrink into the background, uncomfortable with the attention, but Annalise gestured for him to come forward. "This school exists because Sergeant Thomas Mitchell kept his promise," she continued. "But it also exists because hundreds of Americans, veterans, families of fallen soldiers, churches, and strangers chose to help children they had never met in a country they had every reason to hate. It exists because German families who had nothing still brought nails and boards and hope. It exists because former enemies chose to become builders together." She turned directly to Thomas. "You gave us more than a roof. You gave us a future. You showed our children that the world is bigger than hatred, that people can change, that wounds can heal. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart and the hearts of every child in this school, thank you." The ceremony ended with the children singing, not a German song, not an American song, but Ode to Joy from Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which belonged to everyone and no one, a reminder that beauty and hope transcended nations and wars and all the ways humans found to hurt each other. Thomas stood in the back and listened to those clear, young voices rising in the repaired schoolroom, and felt something shift inside his chest. This was why he'd come back. This moment, these children singing instead of cowering in basements, this proof that the war didn't have to end with endless cycles of revenge. After the ceremony, Herr Weber approached him again, the old man who'd lost both sons, who'd brought those first precious nails months ago. "You were right to come back," he said in his careful English. "I was angry when I first saw you, angry that an American would presume to help us, as if we needed your charity. But you did not give us charity. You gave us partnership. You worked beside us, not above us. You treated us as equals, not as defeated enemies. That is what Germany needs now. Not pity, partnership." Thomas shook his hand, feeling the strength still in those old fingers despite everything the man had lost. "Thank you for trusting me enough to help," Thomas said. "Thank you for being worthy of that trust," Herr Weber replied. Thomas stayed in Stuttgart for 2 more months, helping establish systems for the school to continue running after he left, training local workers to handle repairs, setting up connections with American aid organizations for ongoing support. But eventually, he had to go home. His visa was expiring, his money was gone, and there were letters from Iowa telling him his father was ill, needed help with the farm. The night before he left, Anneliese walked with him through the neighborhood. The streets were still scarred, still showing the wounds of war, but here and there you could see signs of recovery. A shop reopened, a building repaired, children playing instead of just surviving. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Go home, help my father, try to figure out what normal life looks like after everything we've been through." Thomas paused. "What about you?" "Teach," Anneliese said simply. "Keep the school running, give these children the best future I can despite everything, and remember that an American soldier came back when no one expected it. Remember that mercy is possible. Remember that we can choose to build." They stopped in front of the school, its new roof solid and sound, light glowing in the windows where children were doing homework under the supervision of volunteer teachers. "Will you stay in touch?" Thomas asked. "If you want me to." "I do." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who'd been shaped by the same war from different sides, who'd found something like hope in the ruins. "Thank you," Anneliese said finally, "for seeing us as human, for remembering your promise, for showing my students that the world is bigger than the hate they've been taught." "Thank you for saving my life," Thomas replied, "for risking everything to choose mercy when you could have chosen safety, for being the kind of person who makes me want to be better." They shook hands, formal, proper, the space between them bridged, but not erased by everything they'd built together. Thomas left the next morning on a military transport truck, heading west toward the American zone border, and eventually home. But the letters continued. Every month, Anneliese wrote to him about the school, about the children's progress, about new students enrolled, about community members pitching in to help maintain the building, about American soldiers still stationed in Germany who stopped by occasionally to volunteer, inspired by the story of the sergeant who came back to build instead of destroy. And Thomas wrote back, sent what money he could spare from the farm, connected Anneliese with American organizations that could provide books, supplies, support. 10 years later, in 1956, St. Martin's School had 300 students, 6 full-time teachers, and a reputation as one of the best schools in Stuttgart. The neighborhood around it had been rebuilt, transformed from ruins into a community again. Thomas received a letter that year, with a photograph enclosed. Anneliese, older now but smiling, standing in front of the school with dozens of students. On the back, she'd written in careful English, "They asked me to tell them about the war, about how the school was rebuilt. I told them about an American soldier who kept his promise, who showed us that mercy is stronger than vengeance, who proved that former enemies can become friends. They wanted me to tell you, thank you, for believing we deserved a future, for giving us one." Thomas kept that photograph on his desk for the rest of his life. A reminder of what one person can do when they choose to build instead of destroy, when they remember that underneath the uniforms and the propaganda, we're all just humans trying to stay human. The war had taught him how to kill, how to hate, how to see the enemy as less than human. But Anneliese Hoffman and St. Martin's School taught him something more important: how to forgive, how to build, how to see former enemies as future friends. And in the end, that second lesson was the one worth keeping. If this story moved you, subscribe to Lost Voices of War and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. These are the moments that history books sometimes miss, the quiet acts of courage and forgiveness that happened after the guns fell silent. The moments when former enemies chose mercy over vengeance and built futures together instead of nursing wounds forever. Anneliese Hoffman and Thomas Mitchell showed us that the war doesn't have to end with hatred, that people who fought each other can work together, that children deserve hope regardless of what their parents did, that a promise kept can change everything. These stories matter because they remind us that we always have a choice. We can let our wounds define us, or we can choose to heal. We can punish forever, or we can build something better. We can see only enemies, or we can recognize our shared humanity. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for helping these lost voices find their way home.